Hello and welcome to the January Logs. I wanted to come today with just the idea of the problem of evil, right? This is actually one issue that has plagued the church for centuries, if not millennia, and it has been the cause of many to leave the church. Um, so I wanted to address it in a sense that um, I was able to understand it, right? Whenever the existence of God is discussed, a common question appears to suggest is that the existence of evil proves that God exists, proves that if God exists, then he is not loving. The main issue that I find with this argument is that we must then define evil itself. And this question requires that we formulate a reason for us thinking that something is evil and some other thing is good. On approaching the question, Christians, along with others, have stated for centuries that evil is the absence of good. In the same sense, the darkness is not a thing and is instead the absence of light. Then they, or Christians, say that all good things proceed from God, that for us to determine good, one must only look at the attributes of God, and the explanation is clear. For others, such an explanation is insufficient, mainly because God to them is not real, so nothing can be derived from such a thing. But also, because if he is good, then what does evil exist? If he's omnipotent and omnibenevolent, right? But then we actually have to define evil. What is evil? Is it something that causes harm or suffering? But how does one know that suffering or harm is bad as well? I believe that all of us would agree that some things, even when we generally agree that they are bad, are not so always. Allow me to illustrate. Take the example of killing. To take life. Is this not a universally agreed upon bad thing? It certainly is looked down upon as a morally repugnant solution to minor or trivial things. Some, more so now, and in more liberal societies, have even argued that it is unacceptable as a response ever. Not even to the most heinous crimes, but even then, most legal systems, and obviously I'm not familiar with all of them to give a proper number, provide the institution of self defense as a mechanism in which killing becomes permissible. What I'm trying to say here is that we don't have objective reasons to determine whether an act is good or not in this framework. We have instead to rely on legal and subjective moral frameworks. The law is also realistically a mashup of other men's moral ideas that we have agreed, generally, reflect utilitarian moral values. That is the maximization of good for most people. But we also agree that consensus isn't a good way to form moral imperatives, as we have witnessed and have read that in the past, consensus has not always been something we currently consider moral. Take the example of slavery here, right? Or in some cases, just think about witch trials, right? While I disagree with the historical consensus of that, we can all agree that it was not a moral good. But what are we left with? The unanswered question of evil. How are we supposed to answer this question? Another thing that has to be addressed is why do people care about the problem of evil? And here I believe that it comes down to the problem of suffering more so than the problem of evil itself, right? Evil is in opposition to suffering intangible. Suffering is tangible. People experience pain and suffering. Evil is a concept and a matter of debate, and it's only a problem when experienced by sentient beings. Most people would scoff at the idea of calling breaking a branch or burning wood evil, right? They would consider it reprehensible to do it to a sentient being. The definition of sentient is, of course, another topic. Suffice it to say that I will agree to whatever image you have in your head. What I posit here is that suffering is part of the human condition. It is required even. Christians will have more objections to this point, I think, because we, meaning the majority of Christians, tend to believe it was sin that introduced suffering and evil into the world, but We only see that death was introduced in the time of Genesis, not suffering itself. And even then, we mostly agree that it means spiritual death and not physical death, which of course is a different question. There are some other things that may make us believe this too, like the introduction of birthing pains for women and the obligation of working to obtain nourishment for men. But these are specific pains that we inherited, not all the suffering we deal with. Take, for example, growing pains. Is there a reason we wouldn't experience them had we not sinned? I find that difficult to believe, and I hope you entertain me here if you disagree that it was spiritual death that was introduced in the fail fall, and you hold that it was also physical death that entered the world. If it was spiritual death, then losing a loved one death would also cause suffering, and so on and so forth. I personally agree in this with the telling of J.R. Tolkien in The Lord of the Rings, as he says that mortality was a gift. And in my opinion, it is said by the Apostle Paul when he says that to die is again, that is sin, that caused it to become such a thing of nightmares. But I digress. If suffering is part of the human condition, then its existence is not problematic. Just as one would not argue that natural disasters or inconveniences like rain, when one would not have an umbrella, are evil. These things are just there, and humanity must deal with them, not as a condemnation of life, nor as something that requires justification. Instead, we must see suffering as life given.